It's a plot straight out of your stereotypical Hollywood rom-com. Our protagonist goes to Las Vegas, meets someone, and they have a wild weekend that culminates in a shotgun wedding, Elvis themed of course. But then, once they leave Vegas, the real world invades quickly, the shine wears off, and hilarity ensues. The person in question is me. But instead of meeting a special someone, I met the new 2023 Kia ev6 GT in Vegas, and we had a whirlwind romance of our own. But once I left Vegas with the car, real life kicked in fast, and I realized I may have jumped into that commitment a little bit too soon. If you want to hear how this automotive rom-com ends, be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. And if you're interested in selling your car, head over to edmunds.com/sellmycar to get an instant cash offer. Speaking of things that are a little bit too fast, this ev6 GT. Now, Kia does make a few other GT variants of some of its other models, like the K5 and the Stinger, but those really pale in comparison to this vehicle, which is the most powerful that Kia has ever made by a large margin. That power comes from a pair of electric motors, one mounted on each axle to give the GT all-wheel drive. What Kia did was they took the powerful rear motor out of an ev6 GT line that makes 214 horsepower, put that on the front axle, then went back and made an even more powerful electric motor that makes 362 horsepower, put that on the rear axle, and for those of you that have been keeping track, that adds up to 576 total horsepower and 545 pound-feet of torque. That's a significant amount of power for not a whole lot of money, and that is really where the GT derives the core of its appeal. It's only $4,000 more than the GT line. You're getting prodigious power and a very fast 0 to 60 mile an hour time to match. That also gives the Kia ev6 GT about 100 more horsepower than similarly sized competitors like the Tesla Model Y Performance and the Ford Mustang Mach-E GT Performance. Backing up these power upgrades are sport suspension with electronically controlled dampers, an electronic limited slip differential at the rear axle, and braking upgrades. You also get these sport bucket seats, another first for Kia, that handily say GT on them just in case you forget what you're driving. It also adds this handy green button, and that's important because that's the button that you use to unlock all of the vehicle's power. In its other drive modes, they actually make less power, so the only way to get all of that 576 horsepower is via the GT button. But we should note that even when this car is in normal or sport mode, it's still the most powerful ev6 variant by a pretty good margin. Kia's claim numbers for this vehicle are pretty ridiculous. A 0 to 60 mile an hour time of just 3.4 seconds and a top speed of 161 miles an hour that you can reach on the stock tire, a Goodyear Eagle F1. But don't confuse these tires for some kind of summer performance tire as the SUV written on the sidewall might suggest. They don't have a ton of grip. Again, they are Z rated, so they're pretty good for going fast. Now, amazingly, for a vehicle with this much power and not that much tire, it doesn't come with launch control. Kia says that the car's traction control system is smart enough to figure out when you're launching and adjust power accordingly so that you don't get too much wheel slip. Our first experience at the drag strip with the ev6 GT took place in Las Vegas at the Speedway on their prep surface. So it's launching off, a very sticky kind of tar-like substance that helps the vehicle hook up. And there, absolutely no problems with traction. Oh, I was late. I was so late. Oh, I'm so late. It's swimming around. Oh my goodness. It's still so fast. I'm just disappointed more in myself. Our trap speed this time is still going to be good. It's going to be about 117 miles an hour. That's just a disappointing showing for Brian Wong. Car is fantastic though. I mean, the other thing that's impressive too is there's not a ton of cars down there doing these pulls. There's maybe 5 and everyone's just kind of rotating through them. It's also just really impressive the way that these traction control systems work with these electric vehicles. The computer is able to so closely regulate how much power is going down to the wheels that they don't spin at all. They just put it down and you just go. And though they didn't give us 0 to 60 mile an hour times, I was able to run a quarter mile in 11.6 seconds at a speed of 117 miles an hour. Fast. And that includes my rather slow 0.4 second reaction time. That gave me high hopes for what the GT might run when we get it on the Edmunds test track. I actually wrote in the first drive for this vehicle that I thought that 3.4 second time from Kia might be a touch conservative. When we do our 0 to 60 mile an hour testing, we don't do it on a prep surface. We just do it on on straight asphalt. And though the GT got off the line rather smoothly, it did start to spin its tires at around 10 to 15 miles an hour, and that cost it traction, which in turn cost it precious time. So our Edmunds as tested 0 to 60 mile an hour time for the GT ended up being 3.6 seconds, a bit slower than Kia's estimate and a lot slower than what I hoped it might do. To add some perspective, that is by no means slow. The GT still beats its main rivals, the Tesla Model Y Performance and the Mach-E GT Performance, by 1 or 2 tenths respectively, and that puts it in some very good gas-powered company as well, such as the Porsche 718 Cayman GT4 RS and our own long-term Corvette. Its quarter-mile time on our track, though, was still really impressive, 11.7 seconds at 118.6 miles an hour, and that blows away the Mach-E GT Performance. That vehicle only did a 12.5 second quarter mile at 102 miles an hour, and the Ford is kind of notorious for running out of steam at around 60 miles an hour, but the GT pulls right past 60, pulls right past 100. It never really feels like it's running out of power. One thing that we should note is that to put up these times, you're gonna have to have a lot of charge in the battery. Kia says that the GT only has access to its full complement of horsepower when the battery is at 70% state of charge or higher. Below that, it actually cuts power, but how much it cuts, we don't know because Kia wouldn't tell us. The ev6 GT is an absolute bullet in a straight line, but put it on a track or on a windy road and it gets a lot less comfortable. Kia has stiffened up the suspension, but there's still a lot of body movement in all directions. And the upside of that is that it does make it a pretty comfortable highway cruiser, but when you're trying to do things that are more dynamic, there's lots and lots of body roll. So for example, on a turn like this, you can really feel the car start to lean out over to the right. And under braking especially, the nose dives quite a bit. The one thing it does control pretty well is squat when you are accelerating, but anytime you're braking or turning the car in, you can kind of feel it getting out over its skis a little bit. The steering rack has been quickened, and that does make turn and feel a little bit sharper, but the GT does have a tendency to understeer because again, those tires don't have a ton of grip, and this is not a light car, so it wants to keep kind of going in the direction that it's in. These tires also, besides not offering a ton of grip, they're really loud. At the very first sign of trouble, they start to squeal, and you gotta get kind of used to that if you're pushing the car at all. My first encounter with the GT on the track came at the Las Vegas Speedway, and it went a little something like this. When it comes to putting power down, it is a savant. You can really just, if you're good enough at getting the car settled, you can just absolutely mash the throttle like that, and it just shoots you out super, super fast. All that instant torque. Man, this thing gets up to speed fast. It's fun in the way that it would be to see kind of like an offensive lineman doing the ballet. Like if they're doing the steps and it looks good, it's just impressive that something of this size kind of does that. And this is, technically an SUV. I mean, we call it an SUV in our rankings. Kia likes to call it an SUV, but for that on a track, more fun than it should be. That track was very flat and super wide open, and that environment was sort of the best way to really enjoy the GT. It's sort of like goofy fun on a track. It's not really precise, but the best way to drive it is to turn it in early, let the rear kind of slide out, and then instead of trying to save it with the steering wheel, you just end up adding more throttle. And the computers under you are smart enough to figure it out so that it actually straightens out as you accelerate and just kind of powers you into the next corner. But again, it is kind of goofy fun just letting the rear kick out all over the place. So when you're considering the GT, at first, it seems like a pretty good proposition. For only $4,000 more than a GT line with all-wheel drive, you get all that extra performance, you still get a very spacious back seat, and a pretty large usable cargo area. So what's the catch? And unfortunately for the GT, it turns out to be something that's only a little bit important to EV shoppers, and that's range. So it has the same 77.4 kilowatt hour battery pack as the other EV6 models, but it has those much more powerful motors, and those make it a lot less efficient. That drops its EPA estimated range down to 206 miles, while the other all-wheel drive variants of the EV6 get 282 and 252 miles of estimated range respectively. Now, much like those other models, in our Edmunds EV range testing, the GT well outperformed its estimate. It got 238 miles or so in our real-world test. We should note that our Edmonds test loop does include a lot of city driving, and that helps the GT's efficiency come up because on the highway, the GT was significantly less efficient, only getting 2.5 miles per kilowatt hour, and that's much less than the 3.2 miles per kilowatt hour it got in mixed driving, and that makes it a less than ideal road trip companion. I should also mention that these tests were all done in similar conditions, all in eco mode with one pedal driving on to maximize the regeneration. This is a bit different than the methodology the EPA uses. They kind of mix the eco mode with the most powerful driving mode to get their number, and that's probably why we were able to beat it by so much. But even in eco mode on the highway, it doesn't give you real great efficiency. At the core of the GT's appeal is that you can go real fast without having to spend supercar amounts of money. You get a lot of horsepower per dollar with the GT. For every $10,000 you're spending, you get 94 horsepower. And that ratio puts it head and shoulders above other vehicles that have gone around our test track and put up similar times. There is one exception to that, the Rivian R1T, which actually blows away the GT, but that's an entirely different subject. I don't want to undersell the GT. In the right conditions, it's incredibly fun. Its acceleration is the real deal, and taking it around a track with the tires hanging on for dear life and the tail hanging out is an absolute blast. But that being said, the GT isn't the EV6 that I would take home. I would gladly downgrade the power and add back in more range. So, I guess the end of our movie is that the GT and I amicably agree that we aren't quite right for each other and go our separate ways. And as the GT rides off into the sunset, I lock eyes with an EV6 wind that enters the frame and the credits roll.